Hello to our friends in Australia and all over the world. My name is Philip Rulo with Rultract, and I'm going to quickly go over the setup and description of the Rultract bilateral system that your customer recently purchased. What you see here is a Rultract single side setup, and this is set up for taking down the LIMA. The purpose of the bilateral set is to be able to transition to the RIMA easily. So what we would do is set up for the LIMA as we have here. Once the surgeon is done with the LIMA and wants to take down the RIMA, we have to switch our retractor to the other side. Now, if you buy a bilateral set, which your customer did, there will be a second clamp in the tray already. That's important because once you're ready to transition to the other side, you can take the clamp out of the tray, go ahead and put it on the bed rail on the opposite side of the table. And then all you need to do is move the top post and the ratchet rake assembly over to the other side. Now, if you did not purchase a second post clamp for the bilaterals, you would have to remove this post clamp from the table and move it to the other side as well. Problem is, this is no longer sterile and would be under the drape, and it's difficult to move to the other side because of that. So what you would do is simply remove it from the chest, wind it all the way up. I do that because you don't want the rake plate swinging. Ideally, I would say to remove this from the post. I understand that most people are not going to do that, so for the purpose of this demonstration, I will show you how most people do it. So you're going to hold the rake plate, you're going to hold the top post, support it because it's heavy. If you go ahead and try to just take this off without holding that, the top post will fall forward because there's a lot of weight here. So I support everything here. I try to hold the snap clip and the rake plate so it's not swinging. I grab the collar, lift it up, and then I hand it over to the person on the other side of the table. That person is going to have to take it very carefully and make sure that they hold the snap clip and the gearbox together as well as the top portion of the post. Take it over to the other post clamp, put it into position, and now you're ready to take down the RIMA. So that's how you transition from single side set to a bilateral set, from LIMA to RIMA. Now I'm going to go over the setup of the equipment. We are now ready to attach the Rultract post clamp to the OR table bed rail. There's a couple of key points we have to make here. First of all, don't rest all of your Rultract equipment on the patient's chest. When you put the Rultract clamp on the OR table bed rail, there may be a drape over the rail and you may not be able to see it. So what we need to do is find the proper place to put the clamp. So if I reach in here, I try to find a space in between the bolts that hold the rail on. So you could put the clamp right here in between the bolts. You could also put the clamp, as I have it here in this example, directly over a bolt, so the bolt is right in between the teeth of the clamp. What you do not want to do is what I'm showing here in this example, where the teeth are hitting the bolt. If the teeth hit the bolt, the clamp is designed to move from one side to the other. However, that may not always work. So if you hit the bolt and you tighten down on the bolt, you're not going to have a good purchase on the rail, and the clamp can wobble, resulting in the system leaning in a little bit. So reach in between, find the proper place in between the bolts, or go directly over a bolt. Do not clamp onto a bolt. Okay, so once you find that proper placement, what you're going to do is turn the knob counterclockwise all the way, opening the jaws completely, and squeeze the jaws to make sure that they move freely. Once you're sure that the jaws are open all the way and functioning properly, you're going to set the top jaw, onto the rail. And then you're going to rotate it in while squeezing the jaws together. So you'll set it on the top part of the rail. You're going to squeeze those jaws together gently until you hear it grab the rail. So I'm rotating in slowly, squeezing a little bit, and then I hear it grab the rail. Now what I'm going to do is squeeze the jaws together, continue to squeeze the jaws together, and then turn the knob. So this knob is not designed to bring the jaws together, it's designed to tighten the jaws. It's very important. If you don't have a good purchase on the bed rail, the retractor can move. So what I mean by that is I'm holding those jaws together on the bed rail and I'm squeezing the clamp closed. Then I'm turning the knob to tighten the jaws on the rail. I do not use this knob to bring the jaws together onto the rail because you may not get a good purchase on the rail because of the drape, and you also cannot really see where you're tightening it on the rail, so you're not positive you have a good purchase. If you do it the way that we describe it and squeeze them together, hold them together, tighten the knob, you will always get a good purchase on the rail. The retractor won't move. Once you have that clamp tightened, make sure that you tighten it as tight as you can. In some situations, we have stronger people than others tightening this knob. If you have somebody that doesn't really have the strength in their hands, tighten the knob, the retractor may move. So keep that in mind when whoever's placing this retractor clamp on the bed rail. You want to be able to tighten it as tight as you can. Now, it doesn't take the strongest person in the world to do it, but you have to make sure that you're tightening it as tight as you can. So now that I've over-explained that, we'll go to the next step. That's going to be taking your top post and placing it onto the bottom post clamp. Now you can see here, and you may not be able to see that up close, so I will show you. The tops of these post clamps have what we refer to as splines cut in them. So you have these little cuts every 18 degrees, so you're able to turn that top post 18-degree increments if you need to. That's if you purchase a spline system and not a square system, which your customer did. So this is a spline setup. So what you can do with that is, ideally for the IMA, in most cases you're going to want the top post going straight across the table. If for some reason you need to position closer to the patient's head, you can lift it and rotate it at 18-degree increments around the table in order to reposition it. 90% of the time you don't need to do that, but the option is there if you do need to. So once you put that top post on, go ahead and grab the collar and try to move it. It shouldn't move at all. If it does, you need to reposition it a little bit. So make sure that it's locked into position. The next thing you're going to do is to put the ratchet assembly onto the top post. Now I pause a little bit there because I'm thinking about some of the things that I've seen people do, that if you train a new user of the Rultract the proper way, they won't do this. But I've seen people do it. So I'll give you a quick example just recently of what I saw in a hospital when I was doing an OR in-service. Well, the reason I went to do the OR in-service was some of the things that they were doing in the OR wasn't quite what we describe as how it should be done. So real quickly, this piece of equipment is already on. So what they'll do is they'll take the top post, they'll put the ratchet assembly onto the post. They're trying to set up as much as they can, not over the patient's chest, which does make sense, but it also could be dangerous. So they'll also put this rake plate on, and then they'll take it out of the tray and hand it to the PA, and the PA will put it on to the top post, and it will be ready to use. Now, the reason we don't want to do that is this obviously swings around. These rakes are sharp. This could hit something outside of the sterile field. So we don't want to do that. So this is not supposed to be a video on how not to do things, but very quickly, let's not do it that way. So please follow the instructions, especially for first-time users. And if you're in an OR and you see somebody doing that, try to change that behavior, more or less. So once you have the post clamp in place, the next thing would be, again, of course, to put the top post on, which I've already said. Make sure there's no movement. Now we're going to put the ratchet assembly on, and we do that without the rake plate because the rake plate could cause a problem putting it on if it's swinging around. So when you put this ratchet assembly on, you're going to do it with the spool over the patient's incision or chest with the handle out toward the patient's head. Reason being, that's the best way to position that rake plate in the chest. So you go ahead and put it on. The surgeon's going to decide where they want to position the retractor. Most often, it's about 3 or 4 detents are visible to where they lock it into position. There are guidelines here. You just put the gearbox in between the guidelines, and then your lock knob will go down into one of the detents on the top to properly lock it into position. So you see there where the guidelines are, where the gearbox is in between the guidelines, and you can see the detents on the top, and this lock knob, the pin is down into a detent. You can tell by the distance here is very small. I could barely fit my fingernail in there. If we were not properly positioned into a detent, there would be a much larger gap here, and then that isn't locked into position. So if you see that in the OR, ask them to loosen it, position it in between the guidelines, and then tighten it down so it goes into a detent, and there's a very small gap here. Now that's locked into position and safe. Something else that you might see in the OR whenever they go to put the ratchet assembly on is this pin may not be positioned in the groove, and it has to be for this to work properly. Sometimes in sterile processing, when they put the equipment back together, if they don't do it properly, they'll put it together like this, where the pin is not in the groove. Although we, of course, explain very thoroughly in our instructions and in our videos, the pin needs to be in the groove. That's not always going to be the case. So if you see that in the OR, you see the pin not in the groove, this can be fixed in the field. All you need to do is loosen this spool cap nut. Don't take it all the way off. If you do, make sure you don't drop it. Loosen it, pull this part back, and just put the pin into the groove, and then go ahead and tighten it. And then the retractor is safe and ready to use. Make sure you tell them to tighten that as tight as they can. And then you're going to, again, put it back onto the top post. It's 3 or 4 detents in. Make sure it's positioned between guidelines. Turn your lock knob and tighten it all the way. Point that I failed to mention here is when you go to put your gearbox on the top post, make sure that lock knob is opened all the way. There's a pin that comes down into the detents here, which I know I just talked about, but you can see that pin there. That pin goes into the detent to lock it into place. So in order for you to put it on the top post, you need to open that lock knob all the way so that pin is no longer in the way. Then go ahead and put it onto your top post. Make sure the spool is out over the patient's chest, the handle is over the patient's head. Go 3 to 4 detents in, line it up between the guidelines. Turn your lock knob. The retractor is now into position and almost ready for use. Of course, what you need to add now is the rake plate assembly. Now here's something also very important to share with the surgeon is when you are ready to lower the rake plate to the incision, you do not want to use this handle to unwind the cable and lower the rake plate. It seems like that's what you would do, but in order to have the equipment function properly, you're going to flip the reversing lever on the back of the ratchet. There's a reversing lever here. So as I'm trying to make the cable come down, I'm pulling it, it's not coming down. I just flip the reversing lever, and then I can easily pull the cable out of the spool. And I say to pull the cable out of the spool and not to unwind the cable from the spool. That allows for the retractor cable to unwind and wind properly. If these procedures are followed, this retractor will function as designed all the time. So I'm going to lower this rake plate now to the incision. So I'm pulling it down, it's not coming. What I'm going to do is flip the reversing lever on the back of the ratchet assembly, and then I'm going to just pull the rake plate to the incision. And then I position the retractor, and I can continue to wind the retractor and retract the chest to take down the LIMA. So again, as I covered in the introduction, once the LIMA has been taken down, we're going to switch to the opposite side for the RIMA. And when we do that, we have to put the other clamp on. You may ask, well, why don't you put both clamps on at the same time? And absolutely you can if that's something you want to do. But I have a feeling that the surgeon isn't going to want that clamp set up on the other side of the table while he's taking down the LIMA. So most often we don't have them both up at the same time. So now we're ready to transition over to the other side of the table to take down the RIMA. Again, you're going to take this clamp, you're going to feel the rails of the OR table, try to find the position in between the bolts, right around the patient's shoulder level. You're going to put your top jaw on the rail, you're going to rotate it in and squeeze it at the same time. Continue squeezing together and then turn the knob to tighten the jaws on the bed rail. So I'll do that. Squeeze as I rotate in. I hear the purchase. I now continue to squeeze. I'm going to tighten the jaws. Now, once I have this clamp securely tightened on the bed rail, I'm going to grab the top and make sure it doesn't move so I know that I have a good purchase on the rail. Now we're going to move our retractor from one side to the other. So of course we have it already removed from the chest. Here's an interesting point as well. As I'm retracting and I want to lower the retractor from the incision, I'm going to hold the handle and I'm going to flip the reversing lever. If it doesn't move, if the reversing lever doesn't move because of the tension on the gearbox, I'm going to slightly turn the handle in the direction it will move. It's only going to move one direction here. So I'll turn it in the direction it will move slightly to release tension on the cable in the gearbox, and then I'm going to flip the reversing lever to the other side while still holding the handle. Don't let go of that handle. And then you can slowly lower the sight. And then you can remove the retractor from the incision. Now I would wind this up. And then I would, again, make sure that I'm holding the top post. Make sure that this ratchet assembly is locked into position so it doesn't fall off. Otherwise you'll have to wait 2 hours for one to be processed to be brought back into the room if they don't have an extra. Hold everything together. Grab the collar, support the top post, lift it up, hand it over to the other side of the table, all the while being very conscious of where those rakes are because they are sharp. Hand it to the person across the table. They're going to take it the same way, ideally. Of course, they won't always do that. So you'll see people take it like this, very sharp rakes with a glove. Not a good idea. So make sure everything's supported. Take it over to the other post clamp. Drop it into position. When there's weight on it, it doesn't always lock into position easily. You have to move it a little bit for it to do so. So if you set it down and it's not locked into position and you let it go, this is not securely in position. So make sure that it is all the way down, properly seated before the surgeon uses it. Just kind of turn that collar, make sure it's properly positioned. Now we're going to lower the retractor to the incision. We're not going to unwind it. Before we do that, we're going to move this so the handle is over the head and the spool is over the incision. It's not completely necessary to do that, but for proper positioning, I would recommend it. So we'll take it off, just turn it around, slide it back on, go 3 to 4 holes, detents. The difference between a detent and a hole. If it was a hole, it would be going all the way through. They don't. They're just detents, so they're not holes. So we go 3 detents back, properly positioned between the guidelines. Make sure that you're right over a detent. Lock your lock knob into position. There should be a very small gap there to make sure that you're actually into a detent. Now we're going to lower the retractor to the incision. The way we do that, hold on to the rake plate, flip your reversing lever on the opposite side, and lower that retractor to the incision. Again, I couldn't stress this enough. Do not unwind the cable using the handle to lower the retractor to the incision. You have to flip the reversing lever and pull the spool or pull the cable from the spool. Once you have it in the position, you can then of course retract. So that is how you set the retractor up. Single side transition to a bilateral setup for the Rultract retractor. I hope that I covered all the points that are necessary for safe use. If you have any questions, certainly email, call, whatever you need to do to get a hold of me, then we can do a Zoom conference if need be. Thank you very much for your time, for the years and years and years of support. Can't thank you enough. Have a wonderful day.